Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Thank you for being here. My name is Ari Jacobovitz. I'm the managing director of the MIT Africa program, and thank you for joining us. Let's get into it. I'd like to start by introducing our panel. Our guest of honor today, Dr. M.G. Vasanji, is a Kenyan-born and Tanzania-raised author, academic, and nuclear physicist. He's the author of 9 novels, 2 collections of short stories, 2 memoirs, a biography, and numerous essays. He is twice the winner of the Giller Prize for Best Work of Fiction in Canada and a member of the Order of Canada. Dr. Vasanji pursued his undergraduate studies at MIT, where he co-founded the African Studies Students Association. And his latest book, entitled What You Are, is a collection of short stories scheduled for release in May 2021. Thank you for being here, Dr. Vasanji. Dr. Kenda Mutongi is a professor of history at MIT, where she teaches a wide range of courses in African history, world history, and gender history. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Matatu, A History of Popular Transportation in Nairobi, and Worries of the Heart, Widows, Family, and Community in Kenya. Before coming to MIT in 2019, Mutongi taught at Williams College for over 22 years, where she served as chair of the Africana Studies and Africa Middle Eastern Studies program. Mutongi was born and raised in rural Western Kenya. Students who are joining us today, we're very happy to have Bolu Akinola, is a senior at MIT studying mathematical economics. She is the current president of the African Student Association. Bolu is an incoming business analyst at McKinsey & Company. And Dikshita Kacham. Dikshita is a junior at MIT studying computer science. She's the president of the MIT South Asian Association of Students. She's currently interning at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as a research analyst. And our moderator, Dr. Sana Ayar, is an associate professor of history at MIT and is a historian of modern South Asia. Her broad research and teaching interests lie in the regional and transnational history of South Asia and South Asian diasporas, with a particular focus on colonial and post-colonial politics and society in the Indian Ocean. In Kenya, The Politics of Diaspora explores the interracial and extraterritorial diasporic political consciousness of South Asians from 1895 to 1968. So, Dr. Ayar, I'll hand it over to you now to begin the panel.
Thanks very much, Ari, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I thought it would be useful to start with some very brief comments to give some historical context to our conversation on the South Asians of East Africa today. There's a popular Swahili proverb that those of you who have spent any time in East Africa might be familiar with. Baniani mbaya kiatu chake dawa. And this literally translates into the Baniya, or the Hindu trading caste, is bad, but his shoes are medicine. And this proverb really sums up a kind of dependency of East Africans on an untrustworthy community. And this specter of the Indian as a trader who's unwanted has been the main scholarly and popular framework into which South Asians of East Africa have been fit in. But this proverb really deploys 2 tropes that I think are important for me to flag at the beginning of our conversation. 1, not all South Asians in East Africa were or are traders. And 2nd, not all were or are Hindu. In fact, there is no singular South Asian diasporic community in East Africa. There's a dizzying array of registers to which South Asians of East Africa identify themselves along religious, sectarian, linguistic, cultural, and generational, as well as class-based lines. Now, the merchants, there had been merchants from Western India who had been trading along the Swahili coast for centuries before the arrival of the British in the Indian Ocean in the late 19th century. And the scale and scope of this migration expanded as both India and East Africa came under British colonial rule. Migrants came from the region of Punjab in present-day India and Pakistan, Gujarat and Goa. There were Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs who migrated and settled along the railway line that was built from Mombasa inland, and settled sort of, they built the railway lines and settled along this line as laborers, traders, professionals, doctors, lawyers, and teachers, as well as their families. Now, this diasporic community maintained, for the most part, ties with its homeland in India by moving back and forth. And also the kind of business and social life that they set up in East Africa was endogamous. It was based on kinship ties. So they tended to have business partnerships only amongst each other and married amongst each other. And although they were subject to discrimination by the colonial state, they were for the most part better off, better educated, richer, had better employment opportunities than the majority of their African compatriots. And by the 1930s, they had more or less a complete monopoly over retail, small trade across East Africa. There were about 300,000 South Asians who lived in East Africa and called East Africa their home in the 1960s. And with independence in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda came a politics of indigeneity, a slogan, Africa for Africans, that really summed up the kind of nationalism that sort of emerged in East Africa in the 1960s. And in this, Indians were seen as something of a colonial hangover. The South Asians were considered as not really belonging to South Asia. They had remained aloof, not belonging to East Africa. They had remained sort of aloof from social, cultural life in East Africa. And Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda saw a series of Africanization policies led by the post-colonial states that ranged from the nationalization of businesses to outright expulsion, as sort of, there was this increasing sort of politics of race and nationalism in the political arena. And this politics of race and nation also appeared in literature. The first English language novel written by an East African was published in 1962 by, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who will be familiar to many of you. His novel was called Weep Not Child. And this novel contained a scathing critique of the Indian shopkeeper, the trader, as unwanted in Kenya. The first English language novel written by a South Asian in East Africa was called The Day After Tomorrow, that was published in 1971 by Bahadur Tejani. And in this, Tejani really talked about the need for South Asians to completely assimilate in East Africa in a new civilization, in a new country. And there's been subsequently lots of scholarship on South Asians in East Africa that either sort of talks about the friction between South Asians and Africans or solidarity between South Asians and Africans. And it's really between these two extremes that lay everyday life and everyday entanglements that were less dramatic, more mundane, less of a spectacle. And in fact, even Ngugi wa Thiong'o dedicated Weep Not Child to his Indian classmate. If we look at the sort of front matter, it's actually dedicated to an Indian classmate, which is really suggestive of an intimacy of solidarity and friction being two sides of the same story, right? And that there is no one single narrative of South Asians in East Africa. And so I'm delighted to have with us today two brilliant storytellers on the panel, historian and my dear friend and colleague, Professor Kenda Mutungi, and the novelist, Dr. Vasanji, who both belong to a generation of East Africans who came of age in this period of decolonization, Africanization, and nation building. And so today's webinar is not going to be full of scholarly jargon and debates about the big issues of friction, solidarity, but in fact are going to be a more personal and intimate entry point into trying to understand the South Asians of East Africa. And so Kenda, perhaps we could start with you. And I was wondering if you could share with us your encounters or experiences and memories of growing up in Western Kenya, and your encounters in particular with the Asian or Indian, as they were called variously, community members in Kenya.
Thank you very much, Sana, for that introduction. So I grew up in Western Kenya, rural Western Kenya, a village about 60 miles northwest of Kisumu. My village had about 6,000 people. We were mostly peasants, and it was a very, very densely populated region of Western Kenya. About a couple miles from my village, or at least where I grew up, there was an Indian shopping center that had about 6 Indian families. most of them had about 6 to 8 children. And I was told, of course, that when I was growing up, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, but I was told that before that, there were actually a bigger group of Indian merchants who had actually made more money and moved to Kisumu to make bigger businesses. Anyway, these children of the Indian families had a small primary school next to this shopping center, and they played with each other. They never played with the African kids. The Indian, we called everybody Indian, whether they were Pakistani or Bangladeshi, or we didn't know the difference. These Indians, the Indians never really visited our villages. They distanced themselves often, and I would go to the Indian store often to buy fabric. This was the only place you could buy fabric in the area to make my uniform. But mostly the information we had about Indians were through stereotypes, hearsay, suspicion, and mostly actually ignorance, because we didn't know them well at all. In many cases, I think we felt badly for them, but we also, I think, envied them because they were really richer than us, at least by our standards. I think we felt badly for them because, again, this was kind of, me listening in on conversation about older women talking about the Indian wives who never moved. They never really walked around. They were mostly confined to their backyards. A lot of people felt that the Indians felt badly for the Indians because they had no land. And they thought that the Indians were weak. They were weaker. They were not as strong as peasant farmers. They also felt badly for them too because they didn't eat meat, which we all really desired. But lastly, the most important thing was when people would talk about Indians cremating dead bodies. And they, for Africans, for those of you who've been around African funerals, and I mean, funerals are really, really important. And so that was just, for most of my people, we felt that the Indians were heartless. But there was also envy, of course, because they had these thriving businesses, and they were really hardworking, and they did they had quite a bit of money. And Africans, the people in my village would talk amongst themselves and say how we Africans were not good shopkeepers. Every time someone opened up a shop, it went under because people gave away goods on credit, while the Indians never did give out anything on credit. Of course, Indians thought we were lazy. That's why our shops were failing, but that is kind of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's just kind of what was going on then. Now I moved to high school or secondary school again, which was a government boarding school in Western Kenya. And it was then that I realized actually that not all Indians are well-to-do. And then there were just as many poor Indians, especially in India, than what we saw. And that India in some ways was just as poor as Kenya. One of the set books we read for school was a book called So Many Hungers by Babani Bhattacharya. It was a book about famine in the starvation in Bengal in 1942 and 1943. And when I went back to the village and I told people about this, that people in India were really quite poor, people didn't really believe me. Now, the interesting thing is that I never heard anything about Idi Amin expelling Indians in Uganda when I was in Western Kenya, yet Western Kenya is really right there in Uganda, near Uganda. So just another small anecdote. When I was planning to come to America, I went, I obviously went to get my passport and so on. And when I went to the airport, there was a line for Kenyans and a line for the other, at the airport. And in my line, there were so many Indians. And so I was like, how come they're in my line? Because I thought Indians are supposed to be from India and they have Indian passports. It turns out that all of them had Kenyan passports. And so that was really, really pretty shocking for me, I have to say. I'll never forget that. The other thing that, anyway, so moving on to graduate school, I'm almost done. Moving on to graduate school, of course, I read a lot about Indians participating in politics, but really there was no full-length book on Indians in Kenya. There were little bits and pieces here and there. I picked up Ganisak and the Book of Secrets at the bookstore when I was in graduate school in Charlottesville, but I never really read it. But when I picked up the in-between world of Vikram Rao, this was in, I believe, 2005, when I started my job at Williams, I loved it. I was blown away. The history, the language, the interactions just really, really blew me away. And then, of course, I learned more about the kind of Indian African interaction. And then, of course, my friend Sana came along and wrote her beautiful, excellent, detailed study of Indians in Kenya. And that has really kind of wrapped it up for me about the story of India. And I'm very glad for that.
Thank you so much, Kenda. I mean, it's really these stories that show how there is no one framework within which we can fit these experiences. There's, on the one hand, there's this shadowy presence of the Asians in your early childhood. Then there's sort of the encounter with India and, reorienting our idea of what constitutes South Asia and South Asian. So that's really wonderful. And we will come back to some of these themes. Yeah. But I wanted to bring Dr. Basanji in at this point and ask him as an Asian, and I know that this is a identity that is sort of being imposed in this question, but as an Asian growing up in East Africa, you'd spend time in both Kenya and Tanzania in the heady days of decolonization, nationalization, Africanization. What were your memories growing up? What sorts of ways did sort of the politics of the world around you have an impact in a much more intimate manner in your childhood?
First, I should say that the summary you gave was a vast generalization. It was a Kenya point of view. Mm-hmm. And, the Indians or Asians who went to Kenya were in many different categories. Mm-hmm. There were those who went to Mombasa and Malindi, and they've been there for centuries. Mm-hmm. Then there were some of them, like my great-grandfather, who went along the caravan route. So before the railway line, there was the caravan route, which went from Mombasa to Kampala and beyond into the Congo. Mm-hmm. And so my great-grandfather had a shop in one of these towns called Kibwezi.
Yes.
And there was no such thing as, and then after the Second World War, after the partition of India, you had these other Indians who came to Kenya. Mm-hmm. Mostly, I think, I could be wrong, Punjabis, and they were professionals. Mm-hmm. So they, of course, had contact with India. They knew India, they were more educated. But those of us who were on the coast, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, Lamu, Dar es Salaam, we had no connection with India. We knew we were Asians. We had some rituals, languages, which of course had also evolved. Our language was Kutchi and Gujarati, but it had changed. It was partly archaic because, all migrants, keep an archaic form of the mother tongue. Mm-hmm. And then it was inflected with the Swahili. Yes. Our food had become Swahili. We had learned to cook with coconut. Mm-hmm. Only later I learned that, in Kerala they cook similar food, but still it was coastal food. And the Africans themselves then adopted Indian foods. Mm-hmm. So I looked at a recent cookbook published in Kenya, which said biryani is an African food. I said, and many Kenyans, Kenyan Africans believe chapati is of course invented in Nairobi. You have this kind of misunderstanding, and the history that's written about Asians in East Africa has been written by Kenyans, the Gai brothers and others, and it's a Punjabi history, and a lot of Indians from Punjab believe that all the Asians went to East Africa to build the railway, but that's not true. In fact, the person who brought these Punjabis to build the railway was himself a Gujarati from a trading community. So there are lots of these details, and when I grew up, of course, I thought very fondly of Nairobi because it was more advanced, but I was only 4.5 when I left. In Nairobi, we had, we wore shoes at home, and we had a semi-detached bungalow, and my father had a car. Well, when we went to Dar es Salaam after my father died, we basically played in the mud, and we learned Swahili, and nobody I knew or met in Tanzania ever thought of going to India. They never went to India. Those who worked for the colonial government in the customs department or the police, they were entitled to what is called home leave. So for the colonial government, home meant India. So these people who had never been to India, their parents had never been to India, but they got a chance to India, they'll go to India. So they went to India. And they came back and brought the shawls and, the little Taj Mahals and so on. But we never thought of India as home. But we spoke the language, we cooked the food, we were called Asians. And especially my generation, we were, wherever I went, after I left Tanzania, I said, I'm a Tanzanian, I'm a proud Tanzanian. And sometimes at MIT, for example, when I went, these Indian students would come and they would say, are you from India? I said, what do you mean? No, I'm from Tanzania. So that identity for Tanzanians was very strong, and it had been reinforced by Nyerere, by growing up in a place where, we spoke Swahili better than the guys in Nairobi did. And we were proud of that. And I'm sure in Kisumu, you spoke very bad Swahili. I remember Africans in Kenya saying, anakula maji. We used to laugh. It was only when Moi came that he imposed Swahili on Kenyan students. And then when I go to Nairobi now, they speak fluent Swahili, but it's a different Swahili from the Tanzanian and coastal Swahili. So you can tell when I go to Nairobi, they speak Swahili, they say I'm Tanzania. So that nuance is forgotten by the Kenyans who write about it, the Kenyan Asians. And another thing, when Gugi wrote about, and others wrote about the Banyanis, Banyani could apply also to other Indians, But because all the Gujaratis were from the Banya caste, whether they were Muslims or Hindus or Ismailis or Ishnashis, whatever. And so it was very, you say the thing to do to put down the Banyani. But then I think about 10 or 15 years ago, Gugi wrote an article in which he backtracked, he in fact praised what the Indians had done in Kenya. But as I said somewhere, it was a bit too late. Yeah, it was too late. They should have realized that, my mother worked from 8 in the morning to 10 at night, and she was not an exploiter. And yet the politicians would call the Indians the Jews of Africa. So and one politician, in fact, said, if we are not careful, the Indians breed so much that we will soon have an African president of Kenya. But ironically, you had a Kenyan president of the United States not long ago, Obama. I always thought of him as a duo.
This really brings me to, the next set of questions I had before we bring our students in. And, that was about a very general question of where do South Asians of East Africa belong and what kinds of inclusions and exclusions take place. In 2017, the Kenyan Constitution gave official recognition to the Asians of Kenya as the 44th tribe in a really interesting sort of move where this this tribal sort of constitutional right had been meant to preserve, the land and rights of communities that had been historically deprived of them, which wasn't sort of the case. There were other kinds of insecurities that South Asians faced, but for the Asians there, this was a real sort of assertion of belonging as sort of sons of the soil. In the mode, Dr. Basanji, that you were saying, of people who have been there for generations, whose stories didn't necessarily begin or end with the colonial sort of British story. So, what kinds of inclusions and exclusions have you experienced in the storytelling that you do? Kenda, in African studies and in your own ethnographic fieldwork. And for Dr. Basanji, the protagonists of most of your novels, and I will say that The In-Between World of Vikram Lal was one of my favorites as well. They go back to their homeland, their East African homeland, without really erasing their communitarian identity at all. And in fact, sort of your books do position them in between, which isn't to say that they belong nowhere, but in a way sort of that they belong everywhere. And Gaurav Desai sort of has written about your work to say that your work really looks at the ethics of ethnicity that insists on sharing stories across communities. So I wondered if you could both speak a little bit to this question of South Asian belonging in your own work before we turn to bring in the students into this panel. And Kenda, maybe we could start with you.
Thank you for the question, Sana. I think that my work has focused mostly on at least my last book has been on businesses in Nairobi.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I asked the people I was interviewing who are concerned with the matatu industry was why Indians had not penetrated this industry. In many ways, the one industry in Kenya that you don't have a lot of South Asians, in fact, hardly any. And people would say to me, oh, no, there's no way that we could let Indians into this industry. It's Kenyan, it's uniquely Kenyan, and there's no way Indians could survive as matatu owners and so on. But it actually turns out that a lot of a number of Indians do own matatus, but they employ Africans, or they have Africans speak for them. So it doesn't look like they are actually in the business. So that was really interesting to me, in that there's still this kind of element of exclusion going on in the business, and it's also exclusion, but it's also that they feel Indians feel excluded, but they also exclude. You know what I mean? So it goes both ways. I think the story of the Indians as the 42nd Kenyan tribe is really an interesting one and a promising one, and I think it's one that is probably going to get us to one of the places that Dr. Vasanji is talking about, where the communities, these Indian communities or South Asian communities, really feel like they are a part of things, part of the kind of larger Kenyan community.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Vasanji?
I think part of the exclusion came during the euphoria of independence, where a lot of things were going on. So, but when you're in the thick of it, you feel it as resentment or oppression or whatever. But in the long run, you realize it had to pass. And I think mostly it passed. Interestingly, the place where I feel most excluded is Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of colonial resentment left over. There was the British, the English, who had the money and the power, and the Indians were in between at different stages. Some were in shops, and some, of course, were in the police and the customs and so on. So in Kenya, if I speak Swahili, I sometimes I sense a resentment, because they think in colonial terms as if I don't know English. Whereas in Tanzania, it's the reverse. If you speak English, he just pretends, So when I speak Swahili in Tanzania, I'm just one of them. But Swahili is not just spoken. It's not spoken. You speak it in a certain way. There's a certain accent. So even after so many years, I know the new words have emerged and new things have happened. But as soon as I land at the airport, I start speaking Swahili, and then I immediately feel part of it, and nobody knows where I come from. So a few years ago, I went on a tour because, when you're young, you hear about all the little towns where our community lived. So I thought I would like to go and see those places because they just existed in the imagination. So I took a friend from Nairobi and we went by bus to several places. And wherever people ask me, where do you come from? I said, I come from Uhuru Street, Dar es Salaam. They said, oh, okay.
Mhm.
Nobody said, you talk like a foreigner. You are a foreigner. Not at
Mhm.
all. Now sit in a bus like everybody else. And, it was just like that. Another small point is that people don't realize that when you talk of Asians, they were also racist, but they were more communalists.
Mhm.
So for us, a different community interacting or intermarrying with them meant losing your faith, which was the most important thing for any Asian community. So that is often not realized. It is not race necessarily, but also community. So you don't want to go outside a community.
Okay.
But as soon as we modernize, like in Toronto, or whatever, in our community, there's 50% intermarriage. 50% of the young kids they intermarried. That was very superficial, but it was there. In Kenya, it was imposed because the British had more or less an apartheid system.
Mm.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And when you said, when you assert your identity as Tanzanian first, that really brings me to an event that is, that I want to talk about that is close to the MIT community. And, some of you listening in might not know this, but we're doing a project on the history of South Asia and South Asians at MIT. And in the course of that, some of our current students, have been interviewing alumni, including Dr. Vasanji. And Dr. Vasanji is a public person. He's an award-winning novelist. We've read his books, some of which feel autobiographical in many moments. But what we didn't know, and what our students discovered through the art of oral history and storytelling, was that Dr. Vasanji, in fact, was one of the founding members of the African Students Association at MIT. He was part of the class of 1974. And this occurred at a moment in the 1970s when there was, as Dr. Vasanji and Kenda sort of indicated and alluded to, there were exclusions that were happening in in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Kenya. But it's at that moment that you arrive here in the North American context at MIT, encounter students from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, but in fact, as a Tanzanian, join and affiliate with the African Students Association. So I wondered if you could share with us a little bit more about your motivation to starting this student life at MIT. And, we have the student presidents of both the African Students Association and the South Asian Association of Students, Bolu and Dikshita here. And I'd also want to invite them to talk about identity and affiliation groups and join the conversation with Dr. Vasanji. But Dr. Vasanji, maybe you can start us off by reminiscing a little bit about the African Students Association that you helped found.
Well, I had, when I was at MIT, I had a close group of African friends, there were 2 from Ghana. And these were undergraduates, my class. There were 3 from Ethiopia. And I don't remember the others. They might come back. The one from Kenya, Joseph Ogwell. And so we used to see each other, and then, one day so these Ghanaians came to our room to learn how to cook, I don't know, eggs, and they taught us how to cook fufu. And there was a very close camaraderie, and at some point we thought, why don't we start an African Students Association? Well, that's what I thought I was, although there's a proviso, I had also started exploring my Indian roots, which I had never bothered to do. So we just would meet, endless discussions, about the charter. Half of us didn't know what a charter was because we were all science students. And at some point it was founded, but then I think it was taken over by graduate students. One of them was from Malawi. I remember that. I don't know his name. And it was taken over, and then I just got lost. I don't know what we actually accomplished at that time. It was new and sounded exciting, and we met to formulate a charter, and about that was about all. But the friends remained. And I've never been able to contact any of my African friends. I've tried on the internet, but no. But it was an exciting period, and in those days, the U.S. was a friendlier place. I didn't. If someone said, "Where do you come from?" I didn't get offended like people do now in Toronto. You say, "Where do you come from?" They say, "What do you mean? I come from here." But in those days, if someone asked me where I come from, I said, I come from Tanzania. And they would say, oh yeah, they want to know more about it. So, it was a wonderful time in those days in the US.
Right. Polu and Deekshita, will you tell us a little bit about, your experience in these sort of, in these identity-based affiliation groups, and is the world of Dr. Basanji's MIT possible in today's MIT?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I guess like to Dr. Basanji's point, I mean, probably you did something good. The African Students Association is still standing today. So I guess it worked out. And as you were talking, I realized, especially like growing up, I'm from Nigeria and I grew up in Nigeria. And at least growing up, there was such a strong association with race and place. And I remember when I was like younger, I was like 11, 12, and my family, we went to Kenya, went to Nairobi on a holiday trip. And I saw like, people that ethnically, I'm like, oh, you look ethnically South Asian, like you look ethnically Indian. And like you meet people and they're like, oh no, I'm from Kenya. And like then I was like mind blown. I was like, wow, like you can be from like Kenya and you don't necessarily need to look like me. And even like at MIT, I met a student and he's American, but ethnically Indian. And he was like, oh yeah, his mom is Nigerian. And I kind of looked at him and he was like she was born and raised in Nigeria. But I realized that in America, if my Nigerian friend tells me they're from Texas, I'm like, yeah, sure, you're from Texas, like you're born and raised. Like it's given, right? People look ethnically different, but they can say, yeah, I'm from Colorado, I'm from like New York. But I guess like thinking of the African context, like there's a bit more of a tension, there's a bit more of a hesitance to be able to say like, oh yeah, this person is like, they're from like Tanzania, they're from Kenya. And I guess like, I wonder why that is, maybe also given more of the recent history of like different ethnic groups in these countries and that adding to some of the tension. But I think at least thinking of the MIT today and like the MIT African Students Association in particular, one of the things that so some of our presidents and vice presidents, I'll say about like 3-4 years back started, was like an Africa Learning Circle. And it's one of those environments where people like different, whether you're African or whether you're interested in Africa, you can come and you can speak. And we kind of handle, iffy topics similar to this, where people are talking about ethnicity, identity, and intersectionality. And I'd say it's probably one of the strongest avenues that at least our association tries to push discussions, at least on intersectionality, issues like this. But it's still something that, I think of recruitment, like Dr. Basanji said, when he came here, the people from like India that will meet him like, oh, are you Indian? Because like, one of the major recruiting methods, unfortunately, is like, just looking and engaging the situation. So I think that's something that a lot of our cultural groups would probably need to be very aware of the bias that might, still persist in just looking at someone's name and being like, oh, you're this or you're that, and excluding people unconsciously from discussions.
Yeah, I think I'd like to go off of Bola's point a little more. So again, I'm Deekshita, part of the South Asian Association of Students here at MIT. And I think like, for me at least, like growing up, I grew up in a pretty like rural town in Arizona and predominantly like white community surrounding me. I was born in India as well, and I immigrated here at a pretty young age. And everyone around me was, I mean, like I was like, my family, like my like family unit was like the only South Asian group that I knew. And I think growing up, like I had this like, this view of what being South Asian meant. And I had no idea about the distinctions between like separate ethnic groups, and like that people can look different. And that's a very diverse identity. And I think I come to MIT and I realize like, I mean, and first of all, I'm very excited to like meet other people that look like me. But I think the other thing that I had to realize was that there are other people who share my identity, but they won't look like me. And I had to be very conscious to like include those people as well. So I think like, I joined the South Asian Association of Students as a freshman. Number one, I was super excited to like engage with that community. But I think the big thing that I noticed about our group was that we were predominantly like a very like Indian heavy group. And I didn't really like, I thought that was, it was really nice to have that community, but at the same time, the South Asian identity is very diverse. Like, for example, like our biggest event in the fall was Garba. I mean, is Garba, but it was a pandemic, so we don't do that right now, but was Garba. And again, it's very like Indian centric, like festivity. We do Holi, we do a lot of other things like that. And I think like honestly, very recently is like when we've started to like question that a little bit more, and question how to be more inclusive towards other groups, because the South Asian identity consists of like a very large Muslim population, a very large like Nepalese population, and I think like including all of that is very important. And I think going forward, that's something that we're trying to do. For example, we've been trying to have discussions about identity. We have a more consolidated community outreach group, which is focusing on that. And I think going forward, our biggest goal as a group is to be more inclusive and more cognizant of the different identities that make up the South Asian diaspora.
Thank you so much. And this is where we get sort of generational changes as well, where it's multiple waves of migrations of identities that form, in multiple spaces. And I think sort of the language around race in North America also is sort of, is in some ways even saturated by an American history and the American experience of race and sort of racialized capitalism and economies that overlap with some of the experiences of East Africa, but aren't quite the same. So I think that it's really wonderful that both these student groups are sort of thinking about those issues and really sort of, I think, sparked to a large extent by the Black Lives Movement sort of mobilizations of this past summer are really sort of interrogating and finding spaces of conversation. In the spirit of conversation, I think I want to bring in some of our audience who have been sending in some really wonderful questions and very full ones. And we have about 15 minutes for this. So I'm just going to read out some of them and any of our panelists could really take a first stab at it. So this is a question that has been raised more than once. Do you have any information about the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Kenya and other parts of East Africa, as well as other parts of Africa? And another question was, what was the religious split in East Africa, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh, and do they interact with each other? Were they insular? And I think, Dr. Basanji, you were alluding to that when you talked about the communitarian divides within the Asian community as well. But maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Well, the divide was not hostile, and there were just different communities doing their own things. And those, what they did was, I think, essentially around their prayer house. You had the temple, you had the Sikh Gurdwara, you had the Ismaili Jamaat Khana, you had the mosques, and a lot of social activities, marriages would take place within that context. And then we had these cricket teams, but these cricket teams are also communitarian, like communal. So you might get a few fights and that would happen in any place in the world where there are two different cricket teams and 5 friends would fight. But I in my experience, there was no hatred, like you see in India. The sheer hatred of the other, the hatred of Muslims and Hindus against each other, it just wasn't there. And similarly, in my experience, some communities may have different experiences. The whole India-Pakistan thing really didn't matter. We hardly knew about it. The Ismailis. So as I grew up and realized what it was, it felt like an imposition on me. Here I was thinking of all India as one, and suddenly I'm told that you are either this or that. I said I refuse to do that. So. So there was a communal divide. Intermarriage was forbidden. And as I said, partly, I think mostly it was due to religious grounds. And it was not that Africans were forbidden. And sometimes people say, you didn't marry Africans. And I said, do you think the Africans wanted to marry us? Their own traditions, their own ancient ways of doing things. Everyone wants to preserve. But as things became more liberal in the 70s and 80s, then you started, people marrying each other. But I know one of my cousins wanted to marry, I think either Hindu or Nishnashri or someone like that, and they had to escape to London to get married. They never spoke to their parents again and the father and mother died, and finally this girl was able to meet her siblings in Toronto. So you had that intercommunal hostility, or as far as marriage or too close an interaction was concerned.
Yes, and you know what's when I was doing my research, on my book, and much of the beginning part of my research was looking at politics and interracial solidarity in the political realm. I would always get the marriage question and say, well, this is all fine, but Asians don't marry Africans, right? And that was sort of seen as something of a litmus test to
It was a
the,
provocation, I mean, there's total
uh,
baloney. As I said,
but
Africans are not eager to, that whole statement is racist because Africans are not eager to marry Asians. Why would they want to do that?
so
Then
one,
they
there
would have
was
to eat
that,
what, dengue.
but I think that it also sort of alludes to, so, I agree with that, but these questions and provocations often shine light on other anxieties. And I think one of the anxieties was over this sort of closed private spaces. But, a story that I was never able to confirm when I did research, but I heard about it multiple times from amongst those who I was interviewing in Kenya amongst the Asians, was that Jawaharlal Nehru was famously asked this question. And he apparently replied saying, well, we don't really marry each other even, so in a way, the personal endogamy was not seen as a necessary obstacle to the larger goal of, a multiracial, in that sense, community. I wanted to bring in some more questions because we really have some wonderful ones. What was not discussed is the discrimination by South Asians towards East African born Asians, the use of derogatory terms as Banawala, etc. As a Tanzanian, my forefathers arrived in the 1800s and a fluent Swahili speaker. I had the same experience as Dr. Vasanji with my Swahili accent when I visited East Africa in 2016. No one in my family has been to India or identifies as Indian or is always Tanzanian. And another comment is that it's interesting to hear about Dr. Vasanji's experience with the ASA. During my time, 1990 to 94, the graduate students served as a stabilizing factor in this. And I know of several PhD students from Africa from the 1960s, Professor Yeboah, Amakwa and Madoi Mezia, who had close relationships and wondered if they had formalized something that withered away. Also Kofi Annan was at Sloan in 1971-72. I'm curious, another question is, I'm curious about the recent immigration of Indians in East Africa and their acceptance and contribution as compared to the Indians who came in the 19th and 20th century, and has the indigenous African attitude towards the more recent Indian immigrants differed? So either, any of the panelists, Professor Mutungi or Dr. Vasanji or any of the students, would you like to speak to that?
I think they've created, not knowingly, I mean, there was business people and maybe create opportunities, but they create some kind of instability because they don't speak the language. And they are more interested in preserving when we've sort of blended, especially in Tanzania. You go to Dar es Salaam, any restaurant, any kebab place, or it just, in certain areas of Dar es Salaam, people are just together. But a person who comes recently from India, I think they stand out, at least when I last went. They create a resentment among other Asians because what is this guy doing here? I mean, he doesn't belong. And this is an Indian talking about someone of Indian origin talking about someone who's recently come from India. So, and also there's a belief, I don't know how true it is, those who recently come seem to have, I could be wrong, have come on a temporary basis or on their way to somewhere else. So when they came to Kenya in the 80s, I used to hear this word called rocket for these new Asians. And these rockets were those who were here for a few years and then they would go off to Australia or Canada. So, so it kind of confused the situation where the people who had come there, almost 100 years before, felt that they had belonged, they spoke the language, they knew the rhythm, they knew the sounds, they knew the smells and everything else,
Kenda, you need to unmute yourself.
Dr. Vasanji, is there tension then between, or was there tension between the new arrivals and the old? I mean, did the old group feel that these new people were spoiling things for them?
I haven't seen it explicitly, but I think my guess is, there is, if not tension, there's some kind of, at least initial hostility. But when you come to know them, maybe maybe there isn't. But then, of course, now the Indian government actively promotes the idea of Indianness, overseas Indian. So now the Indian High Commission, I know, organizes dances and programs that are explicitly Indian. So that, of course, is good in a way, but it also helps to keep people apart. But when we were growing up, there was nobody doing anything. In fact, Nehru sent someone to help the Mau Mau, So it was different, And then now I think the whole approach to the Indian question is partly dictated by India. And also, I think the fundamentalists in India, they've sent out their feelers all over the world where Indians live to sort of strengthen the Hindu identity. And I suppose I think Iranians went after the Iranian Revolution to Zanzibar to sort of strengthen their Shia Islamic identity. So, those outside, and Saudi Arabia has built a lot of mosques, but nobody goes, but, they build mosques. And so, that kind of outside interference has created some problems.
We have one of the great benefits, the only silver lining really of this pandemic has been this move to webinars that has really opened out our audience. And I just wanted to flag, two questions, one that has come from Zarina Patel in Nairobi and one from Tarun Saint in Delhi, whose father, if I'm not mistaken, was a teacher in East Africa. Zarina asks, do the South Asian students at MIT embrace the Black Lives Matter struggle in the US, or do they feel that BLM has nothing to do with them? And Tarun says that there is a difference between commensal taboos relating to diet and intermarriage and the hardline communalism that arose in South Asia around 1947. And it's a comment that says that Dr. Basanji is right that this did not travel across to East Africa for the most part. But maybe our students could, talk a little bit about the mobilizations around BLM that has been taking place, really in America for the last year or so, but certainly at MIT as well.
Yes, and for that first question in regards to, whether or not the Black Lives Matter movement is important to South Asian students at MIT. Obviously, I can't speak for all South Asians, but for us at MIT, we certainly acknowledge the fact that there is definitely ingrained anti-Blackness in our communities. We can see that within our relatives, within our family members, and I think a lot of students recognize that as well. And as an organization, we have tried to have conversations about this anti-Blackness hatred, making everyone more aware of that fact that it exists. And I think going forward, we hope to continue having conversations about that and advocating for causes in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, because we feel very strongly about it. And I think in this past year, it made us come to more, it made us confront these ingrained, these ingrained disparities within our community to combat it. But yeah, I guess that's what I could say for the South Asian associations.
Bolu, would you like to speak to the mobilization in ASA?
Yes, of course. I think thinking back to last summer, particularly under the peak of police brutality, kind of a renewed awareness. I think there was a lot of mobilization internally, in the ASA, in terms of people feeling confused, people feeling scared, and a lot of collaboration with, groups like the Black Students Union, like BGSA, so that's the Black Graduate Students Association. And I think at that time as well, organizations like ours would also receive maybe, maybe their emails, maybe their comforts, or what can we do from other student organizations on campus. So I think that's something that sometimes in those moments, the rush of emotions and the rush of an event has just happened. You do see other MIT organizations also supporting the Black community. I think probably what's more looking at is how can we continue, how can we keep that momentum? How can we sustain it beyond an arrest, beyond someone dying, among not just Black affiliated organizations on campus or African affiliated organizations on campus, but through a lot of the organizations, the cultural groups especially. And I think that's a responsibility that a lot of cultural organizations have, because in this past year, it's not just like BLM that we have seen, like we have seen Asian hate, we've seen essentially like almost every minority group, almost every person of color being attacked. So understanding that, especially within these cultural organizations, like we have the responsibility to kind of cater to one another.
Yeah. And, I must say that as I engage with some of these student groups and other communities, I often reflect on that period of the 1950s and 40s in East Africa, when before the nation had become a racially defined nation, there were similar movements of collaboration, alliance, affiliation that was based not necessarily on a forgetting of the past or being able to resolve the issue of structural inequality and difference, but there were still ways in which sort of, there was, what you would call today the intersectionality of different rights movements that came together. And so I think that, the South Asians in East Africa offer both a lesson, but also a sort of window into the possibilities that that say that differences don't necessarily have to be insurmountable. We have, I think actually we are now completely out of time, getting to 1 o'clock. So I just wanted to thank our panelists for a really wonderful conversation. We have recorded this and will make this available to all the attendees. And I just wanted to take a minute today to put into chat, you've all been seeing the news. India at the moment is being really devastated by the COVID pandemic, and MIT India and of course a lot of other places have been putting together sort of a document of places and organizations on the ground to donate to, and my colleague has just put that into chat, and we'll be sending out some more information on this on email. So please keep a lookout for the email. And I think the South Asians of East Africa and the very many ways in which we belong, they belong everywhere rather than in one place, reminds us that, even when pandemics and devastation takes place in one part of the world, each of us is connected to it, some in a more intimate and immediate and urgent way, but also others. So, I encourage all of you to do what you can in terms of donations to help the folks on the ground. Thank you very much.
Oh, also, Sana, I wanted to throw out one more piece. So the South Asian Association of Students is also doing a donation campaign along with MITSA, so the Alumni Association. So we can email about that too if anyone is interested. But we do have another event on Saturday at noon if anyone is interested in that. And again, we'll email. So
thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for coming. Unfortunately, this has been a wonderful discussion, and I wish we had 3 more hours to discuss this. There's some of our information to stay in touch with us. Feel free to look up, Google us and get in touch if you'd like to learn more about our programs. But thank you, Sana, for such a wonderful moderation. And again, thank you to all our panelists, and we wish you all a very pleasant weekend. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.